you're digesting your lunch. This is not about the H1N1 virus. Sorry. This is about other antibodies and other immune systems. And we are privileged to have Michael Nygard here today, who's someone I just met in Australia. And ever since then, he and I seem to be appearing at the same conferences. So we wonder, is the universe conspiring against us? Perhaps because we enjoyed a trip to the zoo together, so we discovered a commonality. So please help me welcome Michael Nygard.
Thank you. Well, I definitely drew the short straw. I got the after lunch spot again. So please do stay awake. Make sure you load up on some extra dessert, some extra coffee. If people start to fall asleep, I have to start tap dancing and singing, which none of us want. All right. So a little bit about me, and then a little bit about the talk. I've been a developer and architect for approximately 20 years at this point. I've had sort of a checkered past and a spotted career. I've worked in a number of different domains and industries, a lot of it in the web space over the last 15 years or so. We're having some feedback problems. Do we have anybody handling audio here? I've spent some time in operations, living with systems that I wrote and that other people have written. I took the experience that I gained from debugging a lot of production problems and tried to bring it back into the development community through my book, Release It. And I've been in an IT services company now for the last 4 years. And it's actually through this services company that the work I did for this talk came about. Approximately 1 year ago, my boss got his first taste of Agile development. He sits on the board of a company that does medical transcription. They needed some software developed. They got it done through a very small Agile shop called Relevance. My boss was extremely excited about this. He got a taste of Agile development. They got something done in a month or two that he thought was going to take a year. And so he had the natural reaction that a lot of managers have, which is, we should do this only bigger. And so he came to me and said, I want us to figure out how to do what these guys do with 12 people, only we're going to do it with 1,200 or 12,000 people. My first reaction was to try and talk him out of it. Essentially saying, you're talking about a group of people who've deliberately opted out of the corporate ecosystem, and you're trying to take what makes them tick and implant it at large scale in a system that doesn't want to change. Not very likely to succeed. He's a fairly insistent guy, and he's my boss. So we ended up doing a study on this to try and see how we could take a large enterprise and move it towards something like Agile development. You'll notice that I'm here talking about antibodies and immune systems rather than a case study on how to successfully do this. The first results that we have to report are impediments to making that change. So this is based on experiential analysis that we did. It's definitely about large organizations, 1,000 developer plus. Part of it is defining directions for further study and investigation. Part of it is a cautionary tale. Here are some things to watch out for. And I do have a very few concrete suggestions about things you can do to move in that direction and maybe prepare the ground for a later full-scale transformation. I definitely want to give credit here to two of the consultants from Relevance who assisted in all of this work, Glenn Vanderberg and Younes Alrubi. They're not here, but their spirit is here throughout this talk. So, starting with the end in mind, beginning with the output of the process that we wanted to achieve, the question that formulated this whole thing was, how do we adopt something like Agile methods in large IT shops? Something like, based on the recognition that it might not be XP or Scrum or any flavor of these that we can do in a large organization, but we would like to achieve the same kind of ends. Those ends being, well, they were actually kind of nebulous at first. So one of our tasks was to define what those ends are. Why is it that you would want to do Agile in big organizations? What's the benefit to the organization? One fairly naive approach is to say it's about cost. We want to reduce cost. I've had very poor experience with cost reduction measures throughout my career. That tends to optimize for all the wrong things, and it produces all the wrong behaviors. Really, what we finally settled on was we want to provide flexibility so that the entity as a whole can adapt to the changing circumstances of the environment. I think of large organizations as organisms of a sort, and we want to make sure that different parts of the organism are exploring different parts of the market space, different parts of the solution space. We don't want a sort of genetic monoculture so that one variety of wheat gets a fungus and suddenly the crops for 3/4 of the world fail. We explicitly want to allow variation among the business units. And so our goal is to talk about creating flexibility so that different parts of the organization can adapt at different rates. That's how we're interpreting Agile at large scale. I do have to make some disclaimers. This is a presentation and there are limitations of this format. So just a few kind of cautionary messages right up front. One of the first ones is that I'm always looking for ways to change systems, not ways to change people. You can take a person and replace him. If you keep all the imperatives acting on that person the same, the behavior that results will be the same as before you replace the person. It's extremely rare to find an individual replacement creating large-scale change. We saw this earlier, bad systems can defeat good people, and they will every time. So we're not sending people to re-education camps, we're trying to change what the system is impelling them to do. Another message, I will occasionally sound fairly cynical. I apologize for that. It's not what I intend, but it is sort of a natural response. I try to live by these words of assuming positive intent. This was a mantra used by a manager that I particularly respected. Assume positive intent. Nobody sets out to do evil. Everybody tries to do the best thing they know how to do for their organization, sometimes with good outcomes, sometimes with bad outcomes. We're not going to blame the people, we're going to assume positive intent. Another aspect of doing a presentation is that this implies a certain linearity, and it implies a certain encapsulation. So I'm going to talk about one concern, then I'm going to move on to talk about another concern. In reality, all of these are highly coupled, nonlinear systems. So they're densely linked. Many feedback loops exist between these different effects that I'm going to talk about. To give you an example of that, I don't expect anybody to read this. In the back, you may not even be able to see it. This is a current reality tree that we built of the typical large enterprise and the intermediate effects and the undesirable effects that come about from the forces that we've labeled antibodies. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to zoom in on this section, which is probably still illegible. This is a grouping that looks at the effects of enterprise architecture on Agile adoption. And you can see, even in here, there are many causes that can produce an effect. An effect can feed into many other effects. We have some of these backwards facing arrows. Those are the feedback loops that create wicked problems. You can try to change something with a pointwise injection on one of these, and you will have no effect whatsoever, because this feedback loop will provide enough reinforcement of existing behavior that you won't make a change. So it is a fairly complicated situation. I'm going to be discussing it in kind of a linear and whimsical area, but please keep in mind all of the interrelationships that exist among these. And finally, one other thing that I'm going to talk about is policies. I'll talk about policies a lot. And policy is kind of a vague notion. When I write a policy, I write it into code. If this, then that, call this method, invoke this behavior. But in a real organization, policies tend to be a lot more diffuse. Some of them are written down, some are not. Some are real, some are vestigial. But but they do tend to be non-local. And one thing about almost all policies is that they have stakeholders. Somewhere there's somebody that benefits from the existence of that policy. It may have nothing to do with the people the policy is imposed on. They're there for the service of some other group to make their job easier, to protect them from liability, to, well, maybe nothing anymore, but somebody still cares about them. I'm a devotee of the theory of constraints work, and one of the things that you find in that area is once you've broken the physical constraints in a system, you almost always find a policy constraint. And you would think that because a policy is just a statement about how we do things, it should be the easiest kind of constraint to break. But in fact, it turns out to be one of the hardest because it tends to cross organizational barriers. And you find that there's not somebody who can just, by fiat, make the change until you get to the CEO, and he's going to delegate that back down to somebody else. So, as we looked at the impediments and the barriers, as we looked at those undesirable effects and clustering them and grouping them, we found that a lot of this sort of fit into a metaphor of the immune system. We didn't see simply passive resistance. We didn't see people who were unwilling to change and therefore doing nothing. We found that there was active resistance. There were people who did things that were inimical to this agile transformation. So, assuming positive intent, we'd say, why would they do these things? A lot of it begins to look like antibodies. Now, this is a metaphor with all the usual cautions. An antibody doesn't actually go out and attack a disease cell. It signals for attack from something else. So an antibody clusters at the site of a foreign infection or a foreign body, and it emits signals that draw attention to it. And it's the attention that results in eliminating the infection. The T cells, the killer phages. So what we're going to find are the antibodies that you can use to detect when this immune response is about to come and obliterate some transformative effort that you're trying to do. The presence of the antibodies will signal the killer cells, but you can also use it as a signal. The first one I want to talk about is kind of the classic mechanism that we use for introducing change into an organization. That's the pilot project. How many of you have participated in some kind of an agile pilot project? I see a few of you laughing. Are you doing a pilot project right now? Yeah? Okay. I hope this is in time to help. So a very common pattern is we have the pilot project, and the pilot project usually succeeds. I very rarely see a pilot project fail at its stated objectives. But what typically happens after that, I don't want to say typically, what commonly happens after that is the pilot fizzles. Everybody else looks at that and may overtly acknowledge that it was a success, and yet somehow the rest of the organization doesn't really pick up on it. It doesn't take somehow. There are a few reasons why this can happen. And the more we looked at this, the more we found a sort of what I think of as a fifth discipline type of problem occurring. This is a problem where we can point to a lot of external factors, but ultimately when you trace them back, you realize we're provoking this behavior. We're doing things in the nature of this pilot project that are causing the rest of the organization to reject it. A lot of them have to do with the special nature of a pilot project in the first place. When we do a pilot project, we handpick the team who's going to do it. We allow them to break a lot of the rules. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, sure, they could do it because they had a lab. If they had to be in cubes, they never would have done it. If they had to file TPS reports, they never would have been able to do it. You look at this and you're kind of like, yes, and what does that mean? An agile person will say, that means we should stop those things for everybody else. We should make sure that nobody has to file a TPS report. Nobody sits in queues. Everybody has a customer right next to them. But again, we have to think about those policies existing for a reason. Somewhere, the organization believes it benefits from the TPS reports. And so we can't just eliminate the rules for everybody. We have to go and figure out what it is about those rules, what value is being served, and find a compensating mechanism. If we're going to get rid of the reporting requirements, if we're going to try and assign people to only one project at a time, let them focus on that and not do the mandatory corporate training or the fire drill or the evacuation drill or whatever. We have to figure out what those other things do for the company and make sure we do them. Pilot projects are often greenfield apps, and that also creates some issues because most of the work that we do inside a corporation is not greenfield. Most of it is maintenance of some kind or another, and so you've got all those legacy code issues to deal with. The beneficiaries of those policies, by the way, can also create some resentment or build up some hostility. And that hostility can come back in a few unexpected ways. So whoever's policy it is that you're breaking may be covertly acting against the pilot project. We found that the members of a pilot project often engage in a sort of elitism that says, well, we were able to do it because, we're good. But the rest of those people in development, we might be able to keep some of them. So the team that does the pilot project sort of views it as not extensible to the rest of the organization. The other people who are watching it from within IT will look at it and say, you got the best of the best. They'll view it as not extensible to the rest of the organization. The need to have those policies enforced for everybody else means that it doesn't extend to the rest of the organization. So you can get skepticism from outside. Ultimately, it means everybody around this project doesn't believe that it's representative of what you would do if you weren't in a pilot project. We often hear, we're going to do a pilot project to prove that Agile can work here. I think this is a wrong approach. If you set out to prove something, you're already inherently in a mode of advocacy. This is recognized in the theory of constraints literature as the inventor's problem. The inventor will get very excited about his or her own idea, rush up to everybody you can find, grab them by the lapels and go, I've got the solution! And the person being grabbed will go, what's the problem? When you believe you've got a solution, you are filled with fervor and zeal. And that itself is off-putting to anybody who's not with you on that journey. So it'll generate some of its own resistance. But more to the point, when you are trying to prove that something works, and you're in an environment that's resistant to change in any mechanism, you're going to be under scrutiny. And a dynamic develops that creates a kind of polarizing effect. You're trying to prove a point, and you're sort of under attack. So the team will come to have a defensive posture. They may, in fact, subtly or blatantly advertise the things that work while covering up the things that don't. This is just cherry picking the data, and it happens all the time. So the team doesn't want to provide ammunition to their enemies. This leads them to violate their own values of transparency. And the goal of doing the pilot, which is learning whether something can work or not, is broken. You really want to do a pilot project to learn, not to prove. And this may seem like splitting hairs, like playing semantics with language. But it really matters when you're communicating to the rest of the organization. If you approach the organization and say, we need to become agile, and here we're going to prove how it can be done, you're immediately in a hostile adversarial mode. If you come and you say, we've been hearing a lot about agile, we hear other people are deriving benefits, we'd like to see if it can work here. It's a completely different mode. You're doing an experiment rather than trying to change people. Learning, not proving. The message is that teams always get better at the things they're doing. And so you want to do the right kinds of activities a lot. David Harvey had a post just a few days, a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, where he talked about the new Scrum Picture being wrong. He proposed this picture that I really like. For those of you who can't read it in the back, the top part is a loop that shows the retrospective loop around a sprint, producing an improved team, and the planning, review, and construction loop around a sprint, producing an improved product. This top half is the part that I want you to think about in terms of the practice effect. As another counterexample, this is what my calendar looked like for a typical week. So you can ask, what is this team improving at? We're pretty good at the conferencing system. We're really good with the email calendars. I've shown this kind of thing to people before, and I usually get a manager or two in the back going, "What are you complaining about? You're hardly ever double booked." This block and the stand-ups were the time dedicated to a project. Now that works out to about 25% or 20% of the week. But look at how it's sliced up. This is horribly fragmented. Stand-ups are pretty good, but the rest of this, it's only in big block there because I made an appointment with myself to work on a project. You can do that. You can block out your calendar defensively and just take every afternoon, create recurring appointments so nobody can schedule meetings on top of that. I firmly believe that if you have a development group, you should abolish the shared writable calendar. You should not allow anybody to schedule time from anyone who actually has to create something. They have to ask. Don't just drop something on me. I have to speed up a little bit. The next antibody that I ran into with an agile transformation is invasive technology. Technology that gets inside your company and then acts like a cancer. Ironically, this mostly happens because of the quest for purchasing efficiency. So we want to buy a database. So we go and we sign an enterprise license with a particular database vendor, red or blue. Doesn't really matter which, the pattern's the same. You build up a constituency inside your company that are experts at that database, but they also become advocates and allies of that technology company. A good Oracle DBA is very employable anywhere. But if you switch to something like MySQL, you are directly attacking their value in the marketplace. Not only in your company, but their skills are going to atrophy in Oracle, and they're going to become less employable. They will be personally threatened. You're attacking their livelihood if you try and make a technology switch. So that technology becomes a fixed point in your company. And I've seen it not just with databases, I'm using that as a familiar example. I've also seen it with version control. I know a company that's still on PVCS because they have a very powerful PVCS admin group. It takes about 4 weeks to get a new PVCS project set up. And it's in a centralized set of servers that's all backed up and handled nicely. But it takes something out of the team's control and hands it over to this centralized group. They become externalities. And of course, in an Agile project, we're all about cutting those external dependencies and bringing more under the team's control so the team can choose when to move from PVCS to Subversion to Git to CVS to whatever. They can choose when to ditch the Aqualogic ESB and download the Mule ESB. That self-determination is harder, much harder, when you've got these constituencies embedded inside the company. This also, by the way, creates conflict between the Agile team and the constituencies, because what should be a technology decision is also a power struggle within the company. I hope this isn't getting too depressing. I'll try and tell some more jokes. I know this is getting kind of down. I do have some serious suggestions towards the end. I'm trying to reserve time for those. That area I zoomed in on before was the enterprise architecture group. And like all of these things, I'm making a lot of generalities. But in reality, every company is different, and large companies particularly are not homogeneous. They're not monolithic. So when I look at the 10,000 developers in my company, a lot of them are already working Agile in grassroots pockets. A lot of them are working Rut and Waterfall and probably Chaos and everything else. We've got everything represented. So, don't over-extrapolate these to everybody, but I am looking for some generalizations with all the usual caveats. The enterprise architects can act very much like Antibodies because of the way that most companies implement enterprise architecture. So it's usually a small group. It's usually not funded sufficiently. It's not staffed sufficiently. And if they actually try to work with each of the projects, they'll spend about 15 minutes a week with each project team. As a result of that, the EA team dissociates from the individual projects and tries to deliver value to the company by setting standards and creating policies and mandates. Imposing this downward on the teams always generates resentment. But with an Agile team, it's actually a direct conflict to the team's own need for self-determination. So an EA group that's fallen into this trap really needs more funding and more people, and they need the policies to get out of their way. Because I've never yet found an enterprise architect who wanted to be hands-off and write papers instead of code. Every EA I've talked to in an environment like that says, I want to work with project teams, but I'm not allowed. I actually know one guy who got a reprimand in his file for checking out the code for one of the projects that he was supposed to be guiding. I wish I was making this up. The enterprise architecture team and the Agile team can work together pretty well. But the enterprise architect is never going to be a full member of that team. They always have to be treated as an externality. So you put risk buffers around them. You interface with them through some regular recurring meeting. Maybe they write cards that go into your card repository or up on your wall. But they're never going to be a full participant in the team. Despite that, I think more engagement is better, and I think everybody would benefit from doing that if there's time and budget and people. So beware of beware of treating them as an external dependency, but recognize that they always will be to a certain extent. A few other things I'm just going to mention really briefly. We can get this problem of homegrown frameworks sort of getting out of control. We've spent a lot of money developing this integration technology or whatever we've got, and so now it needs to be used on all of our future projects. This also becomes a fixed point in the organization. It's kind of difficult to work around. We can easily develop a lot of complexity in the environment that generates toxicity to the Agile team. We respond to complexity in an organization by parceling out responsibilities and handing them to different groups. The more you do that, the less agile you're going to be. So complexity is poison. Related to the practice effect is a problem of what I think of as staff stagnation. So the internal development staff often will be on a project for a much longer period of time than, say, external consultants. So it's not uncommon to find somebody inside a company that's still working on Java 1.4 and WebLogic 6. And they've got a double bind there. They can't move off of WebLogic 6 to Java 1.4. They can't get off of 1.4 and blah, blah, blah. And they're going to be there for years, living with the same stuff. This generates two things with them. One is sort of an affection for their own warts, which is partly a defensive reaction. And the other thing is it generates a lot of fear when you come in talking about stuff that they've maybe only vaguely heard of. So take a typical Agile team that's functioning at high velocity. They've really been self-adaptive for a long time. They'll come in and they'll start talking about new languages, new frameworks, new tools, new source code repositories, new ways of working. They bring in a whole jargon that the people here may not have heard very much. So this creates some fear because people inside of a large corporation are only ever a few months away from the next round of layoffs. And so anything that diminishes their perceived value up the chain directly threatens their future livelihood. Coming in with an approach of respectful change is the only way to do that. And sometimes it means you really have to hold back and not even tell people that you're only giving them, last decade's worth of practices. Because, that's kind of condescending too. We also have this problem of transparency violations. Corporations do not actually respond very well to transparency. People will demand it from above. People in the middle will claim that they're delivering it. People at the bottom will know that it's complete falsehood. There's a fairly cynical sort of organizational chart that talks about the demotivated, the deceptive, and the deluded, or something like that. In reality, there's nothing that deliberate going on. But if you've ever seen one of these dashboards where everything's green with maybe one yellow, and yet the project is already 6 months overdue, what you're seeing is a kind of Politburo reporting, where everybody's trying to put the best face on the effort or the trend rather than talking about the current status. On Agile projects, we value transparency a lot, so much so that we create reporting to keep us honest, and that's very threatening to most large organizations. So, I promised that I would talk about some suggestions. I have a few here, not a whole lot, some treatments. I don't have cures for the symptoms because I think many of these problems originate outside of IT. We're pretty hard on ourselves in the development arena. We beat ourselves up with stuff like the chaos report. We talk about the high rates of failure. But I've actually found once you get even a moderately well-functioning team, you're actually going to outrun the rest of the organization's ability to generate or assimilate change. And so the bottleneck moves outside of software development into some other part of the company. In these treatments, I'm trying to come up with rules that are congruent with my boss's notion of weight loss. So my boss, I forgot to mention his name, Dr. Peter Tippett, actually wrote the first antivirus software. The software that became Peter Norton Antivirus. He was the Peter from Peter and Norton. And he's got a really unique way of looking at things. So his rules for weight loss are sufficient but not necessary. He says there are 3 rules. Follow these and you will lose weight. It's not the only way to lose weight, but these will absolutely work. Don't eat in front of the TV. Always park in the farthest available parking space. And don't eat white food. That's it. Now, these are perhaps overly broad. White asparagus is probably not as bad for you as vanilla ice cream. But they will work. So I'm trying to find things that are like that. You don't have to know about metabolism. You don't have to know about calorie values. You don't have to know about exercise. And do those 3 things, you'll lose weight. So I'm looking for rules that we can adopt within a corporation that are resilient. The problem with a lot of Agile adoption inside corporations, other than the antibodies, is it's fragile to a few people who don't get it. You have a project manager come in and replace a coach, and the project manager thinks he knows what Agile is, but doesn't. And 6 months later, everybody's back in cube land and they've stopped unit testing because the tests kept failing. It's not robust. So I'm looking for rules that will be robust, easily adopted, and decentralized. So the first one that I've come up with is about this matrix management, which is everybody who's on the team should be scheduled for a whole day at a time and for the same day. So we go from this kind of a calendar to this kind of a calendar. So this minimizes queuing, it minimizes the delay time on getting questions answered. It makes it very obvious when I'm trading off velocity for additional projects. This one is 50% time, this one's 25, this one's 25. The next unit of increment here is 25% if I take away from this project. It's very clear when I'm taking away from a project. Everybody who's on the project is scheduled for the same day. Anybody who you can't schedule on the same day is external to the project. That automatically makes them, which is the pig, not the chicken. No, it makes them a chicken, not a pig. I hate that metaphor. This usually includes the enterprise architect, right? Because you can't get the enterprise architect for all of Monday. This also means, by the way, you never can schedule a single person for more than 4 projects, which has its own benefits. So it makes a lot of things visible that are otherwise invisible. The next thing is, if you're going to do Agile from the bottom up, you really need your company to be adopting Lean from the top down. And I don't mean the kind of Lean that we hear about in the quarterly statements, exploiting synergies to reduce cost. That's the butcher's definition of Lean. That's cutting away the fat and driving up utilization. Driving up utilization, of course, increases queuing time and losses, creates delays in handoffs. This kind of Lean also makes changes very dangerous, because if you're one of the people whose utilization drops because you got more efficient, you're next to go, right? Not this kind of Lean. I'm talking about this kind of Lean. The Lean that looks at flow of value delivered, that looks at software as inventory, which is a liability. This kind of Lean drives a cross-functional view of all of your processes and helps you reach into those other parts of the organization and get those policy changes you need to get past the antibodies. So the next steps that we're taking on, we're looking for a patient. We're probably going to actually apply some of these rules inside of our own company first. But if we can find somebody who's willing to pay us to change them, then we're going to do that. And we're going to be watching for the antibodies. We're going to be participating in the projects, but treating it as a study as well. So hopefully next year or the year after, we'll have some results to report on how using this type of information to watch for those antibodies helps us do larger scale changes. And thank you. Probably have time for just 1 or 2 questions. Yes?
So, I think I'm struggling with why you're equating matrix management with multitasking.
Well, there is a natural synergy between them. There's an old saying that a slave with 2 masters has none, or is a free man. Because people who are matrix managed tend to control their own calendar, they sign up for a lot of stuff and they get scheduled into a lot of things. And that fragments their time and creates the multitasking. Typically there's nobody overseeing the day-to-day to try to protect their calendars, and they feel like they don't have control over it themselves.
I'm still struggling. We'll
I
talk
see you
about
frowning.
it later.
Okay.
I'm not buying it. But
Okay.
I absolutely agree on the multitasking issue. I just don't think it's necessary in the matrix management.
I'd like to hear how it's been done that it doesn't result in
We can have
multitasking.
that discussion. I got lots of examples.
Good. All right. I think that's it for time, actually. Need to vacate for the next speaker. Thanks. Next antibody I want to talk about has more to do with the rest of the organization than with IT. To know how much detail I should go into, how many of you have been involved in budgeting and planning processes, the money side of IT? About half. Okay. My goal is not to turn everyone into accountants. We've got more than enough of those in our companies. But there are important things about the way budgeting works that affect how IT can operate. So a few things about budgeting, very long cycle. Okay, I'm right now, actually for the last 3 months, I've been involved in budget planning for 2010. I have to predict what I'm going to be doing at the end of next year. And if I predict wrong, I'm going to get dinged for it. So I'm going to be pretty conservative in what I decide I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that I have enough budget so come the end of next year, I can get everything I need to done without going over. Because going over budget is a worse sin than failing to deliver your projects. It's very difficult to change. There's a lot of paperwork involved. Every change to a funding vehicle requires a loop through a process that takes about 3 weeks to execute. And this is not uncommon for a large organization. This is what my previous year has looked like. Projects were spinning along pretty well until around June, when it looked like our annual numbers weren't going to look very good. So we put a freeze on all capital spending. Now, everybody knows that a freeze on capital spending doesn't really mean you're not going to spend any more capital. It just means you've got to go back and prove it again. Prove why you need to do it. So we filed a whole bunch of new business cases, which were updates of the previous business cases. All of this horse trading and political dancing began. We combined budgets with other groups that had nothing to do with our projects, but when we put them together, the acronym sounded good. We found that there was a new marketing strategy that was coming around based around verticals. So instead of just throwing products at the market, we were going to try and figure out what energy and utilities companies need. And so we spun all of our projects that we'd already planned and been halfway done. We respun the business cases to target those verticals. This is thoroughly cynical, and it's absolutely normal par for the course. We got some of the capital going in October. We got more of it just last week. But between October 7th and 20th, we already started talking about who's not going to be able to spend all their money by the end of the year and can give some back to the other projects that are going to overspend by the end of the year. This is just from October through December. And we've already got to have all of our expenses done. I would like to say that this is, an act of comedy. I wish I were a better stand-up comedian. It makes me want to cry more often than laugh. For December 2010, I have already allocated how much money will be spent on software, hardware purchases, internal labor, and external labor, down to the dollar. Fundamentally, I don't believe that this ever works. I don't believe it can ever work, but this is the realm that we have to deal with. This absolutely puts constraints on what IT can do. We also have this accounting division between expense dollars and capital dollars. It's mostly the same between the US and Canada. There are a few differences in the details. Things that are operational expense hit this year's earnings and this year's balance sheet. Things that you can label as capital investments get a tax break in this year, and you get to depreciate them over the next 3 or 5 years, depending on the nature of the asset. Now, you would think this is something that only the accountants care about. But in fact, it leaks in several ways. So when you're doing capital bills, which you can do for construction but not design, you can do for testing but not requirements analysis, you can label those as capital. Capital dollars have to have an in-service date. So you have to say, what day does this asset go into production? Now this doesn't mean your project, this means your iteration. Because the assets are sometimes measured at the lines of code. One of the companies that I work with is tracking how many lines of code they change in each iteration, because they're reporting those as destroyed assets.
Well, that's priceless.
In my own company, because of this division between requirements and design are expenses, but implementation and testing are capital, I was told that the project manager needs to track time in 10-minute increments. 10-minute increments? Are you insane? Well, see, the problem was I told them that in a 2-week iteration, every single day, they would be spending time on all of these activities. That in an hour, I might spend a few minutes doing requirements, a few minutes doing testing, a few minutes doing coding. And I said, okay, well then that's how you need to track your time, because there are different project codes in the time tracking system that report against different funding buckets. And all of this is hardwired in the way the enterprise time reporting and financial management systems work. Tracking every 10 minutes, well, we're doing what everybody would do in that situation. We're simply lying. We're tracking it across an iteration, and then we're reporting in whole days. So I don't know what to do about this one. I'm trying to educate our accounting people, and I'm trying to work my way up the chain to find somebody who can change these policies. Because, of course, there's nothing in the laws about taxes that talk about waterfall development versus agile development. At some point, somewhere in the past, an accountant did some interpretation of the generally accepted accounting principles and worked together with somebody about what the product development lifecycle was going to look like. And that got chiseled into stone tablets. And then it got implemented in a whole bunch of enterprise systems. So we need to unwind some of those decisions. And that means education and working your way up the food chain. I don't see any way to do this at the grassroots. If some of you have experience with it, please come talk to me after this presentation, because I'd really like to know other approaches besides just finding the right point of leverage. The next antibody I want to talk about is customer discomfort. Agile methods place a lot of demands on their customers. I sort of knew this until I started sourcing work to relevance also. Now I'm the customer, and it sucks. Being the customer is a really tough job. There are a number of reasons why it's particularly difficult in a typical corporation. Almost everywhere in a corporation today, you have this very diffuse sense of responsibility. People have talked about liability for accidents. Who do you blame when somebody's hurt by a product from a company? And the truth is, there's nobody you can point to and say, that person made the bad decision that caused people to die in an explosion or in a vehicle accident. We had this a few years back with the tires on the Ford SUVs. The tires would come unglued, the vehicle would flip over, people were hurt. And there was nobody who had made the decision to use those materials. It's very, very diffused across the organization. Of course, along with that comes a very low sense of accountability. We also sometimes find a culture of sort of false empowerment. False empowerment is when you hear the word empowerment a lot, and you find committees that are told to go and fix problems, but because they don't have the authority in the organization on the committee to actually make the change, all they can do is sort of report recommendations. So rather than changing a process, they produce a paper about how somebody higher up should change the process. That's a kind of false empowerment. Meeting-driven culture. Any of you have a company where people kind of run from meeting to meeting to meeting until 5 o'clock, and then they start their real work? It's probably a consensus-oriented organization, which sounds lovely and warm and fuzzy. But it means that people are really not accustomed to making decisions. And when you're the customer on an Agile project, you have to be able to make decisions. When you put somebody in a position of making decisions and being held to them, and they're not used to it, a few things can happen. Mostly embarrassment. The person who's tapped as being the expert who's supposed to make these decisions may in fact have very large gaps in their knowledge. They may not know why things are the way they are. They may not know what happens if they decide A versus B on a particular story. Reaching those limits of their knowledge is acutely uncomfortable. Nobody likes to have their ignorance revealed. It's really hard. Also, there's no deniability. They can't say, well, we had a meeting and we came to a decision, or the passive form, a decision was made to do X. They have to stand up and say, I decided to do that and we lost $1 million because of it. That produces a lot of anxiety. When you create anxiety in somebody, you may get an overt reaction, but more often you get covert reactions where they will disengage from the process. If you've ever had a customer go dark on a project and stop answering questions, stop answering the phone, caller ID blocking is really important for situations like that. You may find that they're deflecting responsibility. So instead of answering you, they'll tell you to go talk to somebody else. Certainly, the easiest thing to do in a corporation these days is to abdicate your authority to a committee. Say, we need to get a steering group together with all the stakeholders involved. And you can say this in very positive sounding terms, and what it really means is, I'm going to stop making decisions. And that's harmful to the Agile transformation. And of course, you can get some other sort of odd emotional reactions because we're human beings. You'll get the mood swings, you'll get the hostility one day and sweetness the next day. So these are all kind of warning signs to watch out for. The next issue I want to talk about, particularly in very large organizations, is something I think of as the practice effect. We've got this book and this talk going around about the 10,000 hours that it takes to acquire expertise in any particular area. Some of you may have read Outliers or run into the 10,000 hours elsewhere. This book, Outliers, has looked at prodigies in various fields. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs as recent examples, and Mozart as an early example. So many of us have heard the story of Mozart performing at age 4 and composing at age 6. There is some truth to that. However, the stuff he composed at age 6 is pretty banal. It's kind of a pastiche of other music that he'd heard from other composers. It's not until he was 21 that he produced his first work that people consider a masterpiece. About how long it takes to acquire 10,000 hours of experience doing something. So across a wide range of fields, there's research that says 10,000 hours is a magic number. Well, we looked at where people spend their time inside a corporate environment and inside something like a dedicated Agile team. And the results were shocking. Anybody want to place a guess on how much time a corporate developer spends actually doing software development activities? Percentage-wise? 15? Wow. Okay, you're even more pessimistic. Anyone else?
40%?
You guys are really cynical. I thought I was holy cow. So we looked at our organization and we found they were spending about 40% of their time on development stuff. Analysis, design, coding, testing, implementation. Production support is even in that 40%. Because I consider that a vital feedback loop. Getting the production knowledge really important to improving your skills as a developer. All the stuff that's not non-development, a lot of departmental meetings, corporate events, charity fund drives, safety and evacuation drills, mandatory annual training, benefits enrollment happening right now with the meetings about that, meetings for managers about how to manage the performance improvement process, meetings for employees about how to be improved. All of these things sap time. And when we looked at the Agile shop that I'm working with, Relevance, that 20% is every Friday. So Monday through Thursday, they are 100% doing development activities. Fridays, most of that 20% is actually also doing development activities, but it's not on projects for customers. It's their own pet projects and open source stuff. So they're coding part of that time too. But that's also where they do meetings and all the, administrivia that you have to keep doing. So if this is your time allocation and you're working 40 hours a week, how long does it take you to get the 10,000 hours to be a real expert, a master in your field? 13 and a half years if you're an internal developer. You're acquiring experience twice as fast if you're working at the 80% level. So 6 years, 6 3/4. This really is a tremendous difference. How many of the people you have in your organization that are considered expert depends a lot on how much time you're letting them practice their craft. A famous football coach said, you play the way you practice. So you want to look at what you do most often. That's how you're going to react in the real situation. So, where do we spend our time? These intrusions come from other parts of the company. And they're coming from groups of people who are not setting out to disrupt your day. That is the effect that they have. But their intentions are all positive. All of these things are, noble and worthwhile things. Some of them have to be done. Some of them maybe don't have to be done quite as often as they're done. They're all going to go on. The cost of these interruptions accrues to the interrupted party, not to the party doing the interrupting. Right? So it's relatively low cost for the facilities team to run a fire drill, but it's enormously disruptive to the team, the dev team that suddenly has to go out in the cold without their coats. Paul Graham did a good essay recently on the maker's schedule versus the manager's schedule, and looks at the level of disruption to a manager of a 1-hour meeting slotted in somewhere versus the disruption to a developer of a 1-hour meeting slotted in somewhere. Not surprisingly, it's enormously more disruptive to the developer than to the manager. All of these types of things will pull you onto that manager's schedule, even if you're not a manager. There's a kind of a variation of this that I think of as calendar dissection. A lot of us in the Agile community are aware of the cost of context switching, but many people outside are not. And that can lead to these intrusions, particularly when we get this other effect of matrix management, which is aimed at driving up the utilization of every person in the organization. So we're going to talk about scheduling later. I believe matrix management is enormously toxic to the organization, and it's also virtually inevitable while we still have people thinking in terms of utilization. I have some concrete suggestions for how we can balance that tension later on. When we do have matrix management and the team is split up and their calendars all get sliced apart, we have this problem of queuing. So if I need to ask a question of the DBA, I have to find a time when I'm on this and the DBA is on this, or I have to queue up an asynchronous message, an email, to ask the question. So if I need to get time together with just 3 people from my company, I did a little study, did some math, a little analysis to see what are the odds that I can get a meeting this week as a function of utilization. Because of course we want utilization to be high. It's a nonlinear curve. The x-axis is utilization, the y-axis is the likelihood of making a meeting. This is the 50% mark for 3 people over a week. So what are the odds that I can make a meeting with 3 people this week? At about 0.65 utilization, or 65% utilization, it drops below 50%. I'm less than 50% likely to make it this week. Now, a lot of companies want to drive their utilization up to 90% or higher, particularly if you're in the services business. So if you're at 90% utilization, your odds of making the meeting this week are less than 3% for just 3 people. This is dismal. So you want to say, hey boss, we need more slack in the organization so we can actually talk to each other and get answers in less than a 1-week turnaround. Ideally, we want the full Agile approach. You know, what's the queuing time in a full Agile approach? 0. What's the response latency? 0, right? Because you're just there, you're talking all the time. So we want to get closer to being able to talk right away, which means we have to drive utilization down, not up. It's kind of a hard message to send. Just as a brief aside, I view this as kind of similar to threads contending for connections from a connection pool. And you can look at the throughput as a function of the percent of contention, and you get kind of a similar result. Probably throughput graphs don't make as much sense to management as the previous one, so I use the previous one.